In this episode, we will talk about logical consequences. I'm excited to discuss this because we're moving into some of the heart of the hard part of parenting. The use of logical consequences has been well established for over 60 years. As parents, this tool, when used well, is one of the most commonly used and effective tools that you can have in your toolbox when dealing with problem situations with your children. In 1981, marriage and family therapist Dr. Jane Nelson published several books, including Positive Discipline, that helped lay out clear strategies for how to use logical consequences with children. Her work, and the work of many others, was based on the pioneering work of Dr. Rudolf Dreikurs, an Austrian-born American psychiatrist who in the 1950s and 60s was instrumental in laying a foundation for a new way of thinking about parenting children that is still widely used today. In 1964, he co-wrote Children the Challenge, and in 1968, A Parent's Guide to Child Discipline. I suspect that most evidence-based parenting programs incorporate Dr. Dreikurs' work into their curriculum. Why? Because it works. I will talk more about his approach to parenting in a future podcast about punishment versus discipline. Dr. Dreikurs believed that encouragement was far more effective as a way to help children learn rather than punishment. While a strong proponent of prevention strategies, such as those discussed in previous episodes, he saw a need for discipline, but not discipline that was harsh and punitive. He believed that children needed to have skills to meet the challenges they faced each day and throughout their lives in constructive and positive ways, and that those could be modeled by parents, teachers, and other caregivers. He developed the approaches of natural consequences described in the previous episode and logical consequences, which are discussed here. Logical consequences result from a child's actions. But unlike natural consequences, which happen without any outside intervention, logical consequences require an adult, usually a parent, caregiver, or teacher, to do something. Logical consequences are designed to help children learn from their mistakes. Remember, learning is what the word discipline is all about. Logical consequences allow the adult in the child's life to help the child take responsibility for their behaviors so they can correct them. Logical consequences are implemented in a way that help children to feel respected, valued, and not shamed or humiliated. Dr. Dreikurs established a clear guideline for parents to follow to help them construct a logical consequence. He called these the 3 R's. The first R stands for related. A consequence must somehow be related to the behavior. Logical consequences have to make sense at some level. Making sense is not the same as your child liking the consequence. First, it has to make sense to you. If you can make the consequence somehow related to the action, it is much easier to enforce. For example, if a child does not eat their dinner, they would not be able to have dessert or a treat later on or until they had their dinner. We don't send a child to bed early for not eating their peas. That wouldn't make any sense. Another example might be when a child neglects to do their homework or their chore each day. A logical consequence would be to hold up on doing fun things like playing outside with friends or using recreational screen time until the work is done. Another example might be if the child does not pick up their toys, those toys might be placed in a storage bin for a few days, so the child may not be able to play with them. A third example might be if a child broke something, like a favorite toy, that belonged to a sibling because they were misusing it. The child would need to give them one of their toys or maybe help buy a replacement toy for the sibling. In each of these examples, the adult has to intervene with a consequence that makes sense. It has to be related to the circumstances of the situation. The second R stands for respectfully. It is important to administer the consequence with no blame, shame, or pain. This is consistent with evidence-based parenting programs and the mandate that parents are at their best when they themselves are able to remain calm. Yelling, hurtful language, attempts to humiliate or lecture about the past are largely ineffective and actually harmful for the child and for the parent-child relationship. Sometimes it helps parents to pause before administering the consequence. One of the beauties of logical consequences is that they become embedded as standard rules for the family. If we go back to the example of the child not doing homework or a chore, then being able to watch television or play on any recreational screen would be delayed until the work is done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Children know what to expect. The consequences are predictable, and they can be delivered respectfully. The third R stands for reasonable. Logical consequences need to be administered fairly quickly after the behavior, but they also need to be relatively brief and not overly harsh. For example, if the rule in your house was that your child wear a bike helmet in order to ride their bike, and then they rode it without a helmet anyway, a logical consequence might be to put a lock on their bike so they are unable to ride it for a day or two. You would not sell their bike. Another example related to the toys that are left laying on the floor after you ask them to pick them up, the logical consequence is to restrict access to the toys, essentially giving those toys a timeout for several days to a week. It would be unreasonable and very expensive to throw those toys away. In a final example, if your child was banging a toy on the floor, you are worried about the car either breaking or scratching the floor, the logical consequence is to remove the car for a short time and not destroy the car. Finally, proponents of logical consequences suggest that they must also be helpful. By this we mean helpful in guiding the child toward the goal of having better behavior. We discussed this in an earlier episode on the functional behavior assessment, keeping track of behaviors. It is so helpful to know the intensity of the problem, the frequency of the problem, and how long the behavior lasts when it happens. We call this the baseline. When you know generally how bad the behavior is, you have a better idea of whether or not it's improving. Please go back and listen to episode 7, Keeping Track of Problem Behaviors, if you think it might be helpful. The first step in using logical consequences is to stay calm. Your calm will only help this go more smoothly for you and your child. Children often react to parents' anger and frustration by escalating. More fuel does not put a fire out. The second step is to implement the consequences soon after the problem behavior is possible. For young preschool-age children, the more immediate, the better. For school-age children, having the consequence within the same day is acceptable. Still, the closer the consequence to the behavior, the more sense it will make to the child. Let's say your child has a rough morning and does not listen while playing on the playground. Having them go to bed early that night may be confusing to them, especially if they turn the behavior around and had a really good afternoon and evening. Having the consequence right there on the playground would be the most effective. That consequence may be having to sit by you, the parent, for a short time until they agree to listen. As a reminder, it's important to avoid unnecessary public shaming or embarrassment. Kids will not learn when they are resentful. This is part of you remaining calm. Please expect your child to sometimes be angry that they have a consequence. They don't have to like it. They have to follow it. If your child has an attitude about the behavior or the consequence, resist the urge to escalate it. They may say they don't care. Let it go. They may say it doesn't bother them. Let it go. Imagine the following scenario. Your child did not do their homework or chores that day, so they have not earned their time on the computer, television, or any video game system. While this may bother them, and they may act as if they don't care, pay attention. We'll take a deep dive into why kids do this when we talk about punishment versus discipline in an upcoming episode. You respond with, "You have not earned your use of video games today because you did not do your chores or homework today, but tomorrow's a new day." The reason it's important to simply follow through with the consequence that you had previously decided on is because as a parent, you are more interested in whether or not the behavior changes, not what the child says in a moment of anger. Have you ever said something in a moment of anger you didn't really mean? Kids do this often. They overreact. They exaggerate the situation. They amplify their way of looking at it, and they seem unable to see other points of view. That is all part of children and being on the road to learning how to self-regulate. Their brains are still growing. We call this an escalation trap. Please avoid it. If you keep increasing the consequences, it goes beyond related, reasonable, respectful, and becomes punitive. Hold your ground. If you create logical consequences for behaviors that you are concerned about with your child, it will take some time for your child to come around. Remember the episodes on the process of change? Small incremental steps are the starting point. Keep track of your successes. If you and others involved in the parenting process of your child are all on the same page and consistent, you can begin to see changes in a few days to a few weeks. As I just mentioned, children don't always like changes in how you respond to their behaviors. You may encounter some resistance if your child does not want to change their behaviors. Include your child in the conversation about consequences. This will help you gauge if they see the problem the same way or even if they feel bad about it. Sometimes kids can come up with consequences that will help them to remember better to change their behavior. This will also be more collaborative as a way of problem solving. Some kids respond well when you involve them. Some kids don't want any consequence. This approach takes time. Catch your child being good. Notice when they get it right. Use of logical consequences can be coupled with praise when your child accepts responsibility and accepts the consequence. This shows maturity and self-control. Be sure to let your child know that you see this. Review progress over time. It is helpful to check back to where you started to see if your child is learning from your use of logical consequences. Celebrate your wins. If things seem to be staying in the same place or getting worse, step back and look at what may be missing. A common challenge that may reduce effectiveness is when there is some inconsistency with parents involved in the child's life. To recap, logical consequences are the ones that parents set up that might otherwise happen if the behavior continued. It is a simulation of life. For example, if you destroy your friend's toys, you won't be able to play with them. If you write on the wall, you'll have to clean it up. If you don't wear your helmet, you cannot ride your bike today. If you would like to add this valuable parenting tool to your toolbox, take a moment and think about the situations or times when logical consequences could be helpful. What situations or behaviors would make sense to consider using logical consequences? When considering the 3 R's, related, respectful, and reasonable, does the logical consequence you are considering meet with each of those guidelines? When you have decided on what to work on with your child, pick only 1 or 2 behaviors at a time to focus on. Talk with your child about the problem, how it is affecting others, and what you will be doing now moving forward. You are not seeking permission from your child. You will not likely get a high five, but you will become more predictable and stay calm when applying the logical consequences. There are no surprises. You will be the parent who says what they mean and mean what they say. This level of consistency is crucial for healthy child development and for your relationship with your child. Thank you for tuning in and considering this parenting topic. I hope that this information added to your growing toolbox of parenting your child or children. Please consider exploring other topics in this series. Remember, no one parenting tool can do everything. We need many tools to become the best parents for our children. Your children's future depends on you and the time and effort you invest in them today.